So the only way to, at this point, to watch the lecture live is through the WebEx. Obviously, there's only 4 people right now. I'm recording the YouTube lecture right now, but like I've tried everything. Classroom Services has been here. For some reason, it's just not working. And it's not really that important because the recordings are supposed to be on WebEx. Now, I don't actually know. Let me make sure that they're actual recordings. Yeah, so if we look at last week's, it should have had a recording there. Yeah, so you should be able to just bring up the recording. You can download it as an MP4. Okay, good. So it's a little bit of a pain if you have a player. Apologize, let me close this. But you can get it through the WebEx. It's not as simple as the YouTube page, but because like for whatever reason when I like combine them all into one computer, it just stopped working. And having 2 computers and 2 webcams and everything, it degrades from my ability to engage with you. So eventually we are just going to go straight to WebEx. I'm recording this last lecture, so this morning's lecture, but not the like from the 8:30 to 8:25 to 10 o'clock is going to be on YouTube. But just to be very, very clear, after that, when we come back from break, I'm going to stop using YouTube. It's having so many problems. Classroom Services doesn't really want me using OBS because it's not part of the software package that is approved by the university. So they want to use WebEx or Panopto. Panopto has all of these issues with it about what I want to do, and so it's very limiting. So we are going to go to WebEx only. So the recordings will be there. The analytics aren't there. I'm not super happy that I can't look and see how many people like downloaded it and viewed it and everything like that. But as I go through the exam review, I'll explain why that's not really as important right now, right? It's really not, right? So the first part is, right, I only have 5 people. There's 26 people in the class. I have 5 people who are here now. There's no one in the classroom. I did unlock one of the doors, so give me 1 second. Let me check. All right, so the door closest to the library is open, the other door is not. If you need to talk to me or have a WebEx meeting, right, I'm available. One of the things that I noticed is that the exam actually, people who answered the questions on the exam generally did a really good job. That was not the problem. The problem, and let's just get into this by sharing let me get into the right one. So let's go to exam review. Let's share this exam review. Let's just go full screen with this. So the first part that I want to be very clear, if you're watching the video, if you're here in the class right now, there's a rubric. There's a rubric available. The rubric is a Word document. It explains exactly what you needed to do to answer the questions. Because of that, anyone who didn't take the exam and wants to sort of make up the exam, we're going to have to make a different arrangement. You're not going to take that exam. Because I explained exactly how to answer the question, get the 4 points. That's not fair to the people that did take it and maybe struggled with it. So if we look at this, one of the things that immediately comes up is I wanted there to be about an 80% grade on the exam. So we see that about the average score is about 80%. There were 5 or 6 people who got over 100% on the exam because technically you could get an 11 out of 10. No one got an 11, but that's, minor critiques, little things here and there. They're over 20% of the class, right? So that there are 26 people, 10% is about 2.6, so a little over 5 is 20%. 6 people got over 100%, 5 or 6 people got over 100%. So 20% of the class got more than an A, right? That means they can carry that over into the rest of the course and actually they can get over 100% in the course. So I'm happy that there was clearly the information was there to be found. Any question I ask you is in the slides, right? If I ask you a question, I won't ask you a question I didn't discuss, and I won't discuss something that's not in my slides, right? I know we got on like a diversity topic, but when you see me like talking about that, that's informative. I'm not going to put things on an exam unless I discuss them with you, right? That's not fair unless I discuss them with you, right? So I'm not going to just randomly put stuff on an exam that we didn't discuss, right? So it's all there in the slides. I'm glad that a lot of people did really well, but then I had a low score of 30%, and that's excluding the people who just didn't take the exam, and then the standard deviation of 2.3. So if we look at a standard deviation, what that means is 90% of the results fall within 5 points. But on a 10-point test, that's massive, right? And so this average time, I'm not going to really too much. The average time is not 31 hours. People open the page, and then they look up stuff, they leave the page open, right? That's all fine. So that's just the quick statistics. And here's a good example of how thin statistics cannot really represent everything that's in an exam. Because if you look at this, my average score is good, right? A lot of people got a high score, they got over 100%, right? And my low score, you're always going to have a few low scores. People just don't always take an exam seriously. Why is this? But let's look at the detailed results, right? Let's stop looking at it from a quantitative perspective. It's still quantitative, but let's get a little more in the details of it. The first is that I had 5 people just not take the exam. And I know some people are going to talk to me, right? In this case, if you can come up with something where you didn't take the exam at all, and you're like, here's what happened, there are always exceptions depending on where you're at, right? I know some people get, like, if you get into a car accident or, right, if you get really sick, we're in the middle of a pandemic. If something really bad happened to you, talk to me. I'm a human being, right? I am often in poor health, right? So I recognize that that's going to impact your ability to get through your course, right? And perform at your highest level. Talk to me about those things, and that can be part of the activity, right? The other part is that I only had 6 people, which is about 20%, who got under a passing grade. Right? So I don't love that, right? But that means it's about 20% who are at the bottom, right? The bottom 20%, right? They didn't do as well. And then I have 5 people at the top that got over 100%. I think I had one person with like a 99% or a 9.9, so yeah, 99%. So there are a lot of people that got A's, but they put in a lot of work, right? They really gave me an answer. They looked at the material and the slides, right? And they showed that they had read the material. So the part about the material being available and you being able to do it, that's not the issue that we sort of found. Now, the average of 79% doesn't include the zeros, so maybe it's a little worse, right? But the part that I'm concerned is bimodal results. If you look, there's a lot of people at the bottom, there's a lot of people at the top, and very few people got a C or a B, right? At a lot of A's and a lot of bad grades. So what that means is that we have in 2 different groups, right? You have the one group that are sort of self-starters, that they don't even need me, right? I'm an impediment to whatever they're doing, right? They just want to get through the course, they can read the material, pass the exam. I'm just here to make them listen for 3 hours a week, right? And they're just going to get through, right? So these autodidacts or people who are sort of self-learners, right? They don't really need help. So they're just going to go and they're not going to contact me. They're going to do the work and they're going to get out as quick as possible. And then I have a group that's struggling. And I don't know that they're struggling because we don't have face-to-face communication, right? I can't see your faces. I can't see your eyes glaze over when you're like, I don't get this at all. So I'm going to sort of phase out of this. I can't see your connection to say, okay, I can see you. So one of the things is ask me more questions. If you're not sure about something when we're in the lecture, obviously that's kind of a problem because I have maybe 20% who are in the lecture today. Maybe some people will watch it later, but if I look at the views on the last YouTube video for just the recording, there are only 5 views. And I think I had 8 people, which means only half of the class even watched the last lecture or even has any information about that, right? So don't disengage, right? Don't disengage because if you ask me for help, I have plenty of time to help you. This is the only class I teach. There's only 26 of you. I have a wealth of time that I can dedicate to you, right? So if you're watching this as a recording or you're here there, right, look at the rubric, look at what you got wrong and say, okay, I don't understand this, or here's what I can do better. Now, the biggest part about this, the bad grades, none of them were really about responses. Some people got bad response grades, but almost every person who didn't do as well in the exam didn't answer all the questions, right? Answer all of the questions. Make sure that, sorry, I have a hat on. Make sure that you're answering each question in an exam, right? Because it's gonna change a little bit, but you're still gonna be required to finish the exam. Make sure you have enough time, right? Know how to look through the slides. And one of the things that I would give you as advice is if you say, I'm not sure, download my slides, use the hotkey Control F in the slides to look for words like South Korea. And if you look for words like South Korea, one of the things you'll come up is the industrialization in one of my slides. Like, when was I talking about it? And if you go to that slide, you say, okay, well, it's this slide, and this slide is tied to this lecture, you can go to just that minute that I'm talking about, right? It's all available to you, downloadable, right? You can look at the lectures, all of it's available, and it's in the readings, right? It's in the readings, it's in the lectures, so make sure that you are using the resources that are being made available, right? It's taking a lot to get these resources to you, so make sure you're taking advantage of them, right? And answer every question. Now, the thing is, I know that that was too long of a test, right? There's going to be a lot of opportunities for you to make it up. It's only 10% of your grade, right? And I think maybe the 5 people to do it, right, I'm going to work with them separately, right? Some people are just dropping out, or they're just in school because there's not really a better option, but they're not really trying, right? Some of them I'm going to have trouble reaching out and sort of grabbing. But everyone who took the exam, right, if they struggled, I'm going to give you an opportunity to do better. One of the things that you're going to notice when you go into the Web Campus shell for this course is there's extra credit. I decided to take the fuller article. We're not going to cover it. It's not going to be in the exam, right? But if you read it, you can give me a little over a 1-page summary and analysis of it. And if you do a good job summarizing and analyzing the scientific points of it, you can get 2 points. There's only 100 points in the course. So you can increase your total grade 2% if you do that extra credit. So there's always going to be options. The other part, because the exam was too long, I think it's going to be easier for you is if I give multiple choice questions. So about 50 to 75% of future exams will be multiple choice. So you can say, okay, very clear answer, I clicked on it, I'm going to go through, and then at max 1 to 2 essay questions. Because even the people who did really well spent a couple of hours on it. And because I didn't give you time off in class, and we'll talk about how I'm going to adjust the rest of the course to make sure you have time off to take these exams. Right, normally I would say I'll lecture in the morning, and then I'll give you the afternoon part, right, the 10 to 11:15 to take it, and I'll give you some time, right? So I'm still planning on doing that, right? So when we go into the week before spring break, which I think is like 2 weeks away, you're going to take an exam on that Friday, right? Or you can take an exam on Friday. I'm going to give you a whole week to do it, right? Starting that Friday to the next Friday. So you could do it before spring break, you can do it during spring break, it's up to you, but you can just get it out of the way, right? I hate having an exam after spring break because I want you to take that week and sort of recharge your batteries. I always catch up on a lot of material during spring break, so I don't want to put you in a bad position, but also when you come back, you'll have the graded exam and we can move forward to the next section. So just make those adjustments. The other part is that I am open to suggestions from you. If there's something where you're like, this is too scientific, or I'm not getting it, because the next thing we're going to talk about is Hagstrom's article, and it's really scientific. It has a lot of methods in it. It has a lot of statistics in it. And I'm not going to test you on that. One, I'm not going to test you on that, right? I tested you on what an independent variable is and a dependent variable. I don't expect any of you to know regression analysis yet, right? That's 302, right? We have a course for that, Political Science 302. I wanted you to understand the basic research design, right? I wanted you to get those things. So if you have any other suggestions, right, you can email me, you can talk to me about it. If you're not at the grade that you want to be at, right, do that fuller, right, really put some effort to do that fuller extra credit, right, that you can just jump your grade up 2%, and we only have like 25% in, right, so everyone can still get an A in this class, right, no one's really missing anything. There's another quiz in, right, so when you get the quiz in and the extra credit, only about 40% of your grade is based on the exam, right, so you can really sort of pull that grade out if you didn't do as well, right? So if you have any suggestions, feel free to email me, feel free to talk to me about them. I am available for WebEx 11:30 to like 1 o'clock. I can be in this room, there's no one's coming. But you have to set an appointment because I can't just be in this room all the time, but if I have a setup like a meeting to meet with you, if you need to meet at a different time like a WebEx, that's always possible, but it's a little more difficult because I have to set up in my home or I have to go to some place that I can set up WebEx. So let me know. When you email me, I know that there's some questions I didn't answer, but I thought that they gave away certain parts of the exam and I want to do it after the exam, right? And if you look at the rubric, some of you asked me questions that the answer that you were asking, right, was part of the question you were emailing me, right? And so I wanted you to get to the exam first and then talk about it. Okay, so that's all the exam review we're gonna do. I gave you a clear rubric. If you have questions or challenges, I know a lot of professors are like, I hate it when they challenge me. Challenge me on the grade. If you have a logical challenge, you're like, I presented this evidence and you said I didn't, challenge me. You don't know if I will give you more points, right? Maybe I didn't see something. You always have that option, right? But make sure you challenge me on a valid point. Because if you challenge me, you're like, I should just get more points, because that's going to be a waste of your time, right? Make sure you have some rationale for it. All right, so let's move out of this. And let's go into the exam review PowerPoint. The PowerPoint rubric is all available. All the slides are always available before class, and then you have a quiz and everything up right now. So let's close that, and let's get through some Hagström. Really? Yeah, this is the other part about the YouTube. It's like, I have to jump back and forth, and I think it damages the flow of what I'm trying to talk about enough that we're sort of hitting this wall that we maybe shouldn't be hitting. So YouTube is definitely going away. And I don't own the YouTube account, the school owns the YouTube, and there's all sorts of, it's just gonna be easier to just switch to WebEx the whole time. It'll encourage you to actually be in class. I think that's gonna benefit a lot of you. I know it's early in the morning, but right, you signed up for the class. We have to be able to engage in this a little. All right, so now let's get into the last part. We're going to talk about democratic regimes before we get into, before we get into autocratic regimes. So, Hagström, we already talked about the earlier part, sort of polity versus Freedom House. And now Hagström is going to provide us some evidence about how we know that they're different and that they don't always come up with the same result. The first part is there's this thing called ordinary least squares. And you're going to hear this a lot, right? This is sort of the easiest way to run a regression method. It's the easiest way, right? OLS is the simplest way. You're going to see it a lot throughout this course. I'm not going to test you on this. I don't expect you to know OLS. That's for 302. I'm introducing you so you can recognize the language, but it's not really something we're going to test on, so don't stress about it. What you're going to hear again in 302 is that there are assumptions of OLS. So when you see someone run OLS, maybe they made a mistake, right? Because first, it has to have a linear relationship. A linear relationship just means that the line that determines how much correlation there is should go sort of in a linear path. What it shouldn't do is sort of a curvilinear, like this, bell-shaped, right? That's sort of the x-squared bell shape. That's not an OLS regression, right? That doesn't fit that linear relationship. The other part about OLS is that it has to be an interval-dependent variable. The dependent variable has to go from like 1 to 99, an increase of increments of 1, or 0.1 or something, right? That it can go from 0 to 0.2, that's still an interval. Right? It's still a mathematical interval over some scale. But typically you want a continuous interval, but it kind of depends, right? 1, 2, 3, 4 is an interval, but also 1.1, 1.2, 1.3, that's an interval as well. What you can't have is a dichotomous variable. You can't say yes or no, right? And in here I say true and false. And I know I told a lot of you don't say true and false. Here I mean in a binary sense. It either, like we're saying, oh, is this Georgia, the state of Georgia, the country of Georgia? And it's either true, yes it is, or false, no it's not. And it's sort of ones and zeros, right? In very, very simple binary language, right? And when we do a regression, we might think, okay, either it is or it is not certain things. Either it is in Europe or it's not in Europe. And so it's okay to run a binary if it's not the dependent variable. But the dependent variable can't be dichotomous binary dummy. And dichotomous means one or the other, right? It means one case or the other. Binary is a 1 and 0 system, and dummy is a dummy variable is a term we use to say when there's only two possibilities, true and false, 1 and 0, right? Is not, right? So we don't want that in OLS, right? And I'm just introducing this, right, very quickly so we can understand later when we're talking about this, right? And as you move forward, those of you who are political scientists will have to learn this at the point. But if you're not, right, because I have a mixed class of political scientists or political science majors and non-majors, right, I'm not going to test you on this. I just want to get you used to understanding the language. And if you read it, you're like, I don't understand this, right? It gives you a little more clarity of the article we just read, or the article we read last week. Now, this next part, I do expect you to know, because it's really going to start to impact on a lot of the theories we talk about. The first is modernization theory. And modernization theory sort of sets up this precursor, that before you can have a democracy, you have to have minimum levels of wealth, industrialization, urbanization, and education. That there's sort of levels that are required. Even if we look at Scotch Pole, right, going from the beginning of the 20th century into like 1917 and 1919 with the Russian revolutions, right, France is a little ahead of its time, right, but the Chinese Revolution is in the middle of the 20th century. What we see is agricultural societies, agrarian societies, where farming is controlling, land ownership is the biggest thing, transitioning into industrial societies. And so the previous elites, the landed elites, are not having the same interests as those who are industrial elites, the ones who own the manufacturing plants. Because property, the land that they use, is declining in value. I don't need thousands of acres, right? A farmer needs thousands of acres. If I'm an industrialist and I have a manufacturing plant, I don't need thousands of acres of land. I need a workforce. I need an educated workforce. And educated means different things at different times. But if you're making steel or iron, you need the workers to understand how to make steel and iron, how to be safe, how to not waste material. You need them to know certain things to ramp up production as best as possible. And safety is a term that we use very differently today versus the 20th century, right? They would mean safety like don't damage the equipment, right? Whereas today we would say the health of the workers matters, right? But in both, they need education to understand that. So modernization theory says, as you're going through this process of increased wealth and industrialization and urbanization, all of these people that used to live out in farms and separate societies, they come together and they live in big cities. They start interacting with each other. They start having jobs that have a set amount of hours. So you get up in the morning, you work until a certain period, and you go home. Right now, you're working 10-hour or 12-hour days, but at some point, you go home, and you're not on your farm by yourself, you're with a bunch of other people who have a greater education. And you start communicating with your public, right, in the neighborhoods that you live, and you start talking about maybe we should have better working conditions. Maybe I should get a vote in the government, right? And so modernization theory is really important because it talks about this 20th century movement that really starts to matter and how we talk about democratization, right? Democracies can be argued to need certain levels of wealth and industrialization, and especially urbanization, for political change and for a democratic transition, right? Urbanization is just where people move from rural areas out in the farms and sort of out in sparse land, and they sort of concentrate into cities. That's all urbanization is, right? Now, later in the 21st century, it gains this connotation of like different values, but for the most part, it just means concentration of people in the cities, right? They're closer, they're meeting each other's preferences, there are all these concerns, right? Now you have this need for firefighters, right, and police force, right? And it sort of creates this demand for the government to do stuff, and this interaction where they say we should have a vote and a say in this. So we do see a positive relationship between democracy and development, right? And positive here just means as one increases, the other increases. As development increases, the likelihood of a democratic transition increases, right? So one of the things that they're looking at is, okay, we know this relationship, we argue in the theory that modernization theory says this exists, so let's test it. Let's look at the economy, GDP per capita, gross domestic product per capita. So let's look at how big the economy is as a measure of wealth and industrialization. And let's look at total enrollment ratio in education. People are going to school, so they're more educated. They're a more educated workforce, all of the things that are tied to modernization theory. And let's see if they come up with different impacts between polity, for one measure of democracy, and Freedom House, another measure of democracy. Hold on one second. This is not. I apologize. The YouTube's just not changing slides. Okay. How about that? There we go. Okay. I apologize because this is definitely a pain. Okay. So We make this argument, and then we make the next argument that, very simple argument, the larger the area, the harder it's going to be a democracy, right? If you have this huge landmass, they're not as homogeneous, right? The people that live in Greece are much more similar than the people that live in Russia, right? When Russia, you have the Caucasus region, right? Caucasus region is sort of in the south, the southwest, is very different, right? There are a lot of Muslims, right? And I'm not saying there's any connotation, right? But the behavior is different, the weather is different, especially if we compare the northeast, right? The Siberian region, right? Which is very white, right? Very orthodox, right? Has a different religious connotation, different culture, different behavior. That is a country that is under one government, but people are dramatically different, right? And I'm only just saying that as a scale up because if we look at the US, huge differences in the US, right? We are a very diverse society. And so we're going to have different preferences. Just by area alone, we're going to have different preferences. And the next part is population. And we actually talked about this in polyarchy, that when you have a larger and larger democracy, it's harder to scale up. Democracies are hard to scale up because you need better infrastructure, you need distribution systems, right? If 5 of us decide we're going to go to lunch, right, we can all just hop in a car. I mean, 4 of us, maybe 5, depending on the car. We can just decide, right, and we'll sort of all agree on something we can all have, and we'll go to lunch and it'll be done. If you need to provide lunches for 10 million children, right, the distribution and the infrastructure needed for that is very, very different, right? As you grow as a population, they're very different. So these are 4 real impacts on democracy that are supported by the theory that Hagström's pointing out. So then, right, Hagström says, let's look at these models, these different models, and they have a different n, right? Remember, n is the number of cases, right? So this has a larger n, and this has a smaller n. Even though they're both pretty large n data sets, this one's slightly larger. So I'm going to use Freedom House, which has more countries in the data set. And then I'm going to use 2 different data sets, one with Freedom House and one Polity, and I'm going to sort of set up the exclusions so they have the same number of cases, the same number of countries, right? And this one has more because they allow for countries with smaller populations, and Polity excludes microstates, so states that have less than 500,000 people, right? And there are just some countries that are very small, and a very small country behaves differently, right? If your population is like 200,000, the way you interact with that population is very different than, say, the United States, which has 370 million people, somewhere around there. And when you have like 1.5, 1.6 billion people in China, you just have to behave differently, right? There's a scaling effect that we have to recognize. So these 2 should behave differently. This one should be slightly different because it includes those microstates. So we're only going to look at one table. Now, I don't want you to think that you're going to be tested on this. I just want you to start at the beginning here and get a little bit, that's why we're going really fast through this. If you look, here is, it took away this should be negative, and I can't edit it. So this should be negative. No, positive. So what we see is that as these increase, right, this is the likelihood of a democratization. So the R squared says this is how much they explain. Right? They explain 27% of democratic transitions, and education explains about 24%, right? Roughly, right? Don't use my exact quotes. I'm not trying to get you to learn all the statistics, but the point is, right, this explains a portion of democratization, and this explains a portion. What matters here is these significance numbers. These are very significant, right? Anything below a 0.05 is statistically significant. And so we can say that, yeah, based on his tests, Hagström says, right, and he provides a theoretical proof. But remember, I talked about this, and in the exams we talked about this. You've got to set up the problem. Then you have to set up the theory, which Hagström explains in modernization theory, right, area size, population, that these matter. And then now let's run some tests. And they run some tests, and they get that these are significant factors. Right? That they do matter, they're significant factors. So what matters here is we're measuring how democratic a state is, or how free a state is. But our measures aren't all the same. They're not all the same measures, and so what he finds out is why there is a high correlation. If you take the Freedom House and the Polity 4 indices, with only including 158 countries, they're the same about 87% of the time, 87 to 88% of the time. The problem is that significant differences occur when you deal with population and education and GDP per capita. This is a really big problem for some states dealing with Polity 5, right? The Congo is treated as a democracy under Polity 5, but it's treated as an autocracy, right, by Freedom House. So what's important here is we have measures of democracy. What I really want you to understand is when we have these measurements, they're built, right, they're set up, right? Because a lot of them like, oh, we use quantitative, it takes away bias. You code these numbers in. We decide the metrics and the coding and the operation of these numbers so they can still have bias, right? Because if there was no bias, they'd be exactly the same, right? They measure different things, right? Remember, Polity 4 isn't as much dealing with freedom, it's much more focused on the chief executive. Many of its variables and its indicators deal with what can the chief executive do, how is the chief executive chosen. So the behavior is very different for these two metrics, and because of that, right, we want to understand that we always want to look at whatever the data we're pointing to and say, okay, what does that matter? Now let's get back to this democratic and autocratic regimes. When we decide a regime is autocratic versus democratic, we're going to be looking at these metrics. So we want to make sure that if we use a data set, if we use a quantitative data set, right, we're using numbers, we're including 158 countries, we're running the regression, that we can explain why we use the numbers we did. If any of you ever get to this point where you're looking at like a data set, you can open what's called a code book. And the code book will explain why they coded every variable the way that they did, right? Because you need that to explain what happened, right? One of the things about a scientific endeavor is you want to document everything you possibly can so that when people come after you can say, why did you do it this way? And even if they disagree, they can say, okay, I understand that's why you did that way. I might disagree, but that doesn't make your work less scientific. It just means that they have a theoretical reason or some sort of argument for why they would do it different, right? Science has a lot of competition, a lot of arguments. Those are all fair in a scientific endeavor. All right. So I didn't want to spend too much time on that. Let's get into the next one. Why? Okay. Okay, that's not bad. Sorry, the computer's decided that it's gonna fight me now. All right. If it crashes in a minute, I apologize. What is happening? That's fine. One second. No. There we go.
Yeah.
I apologize. It's taking a second. It should load in. I don't know why.
Oh, thank you. Can you hand me a water bottle, please?
Just so you know, your mic's on.
Shit, sorry.
All right. I am